The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Nurse Rita Patel trudged through the busy hallway of Metropolitan General Hospital's third floor. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of another exhausting shift, her normally neat ponytail now messy and loose after 16 grueling hours. The clock on the wall showed 7:45 p.m., just 15 minutes before her second consecutive shift would finally end. "Rita, we need you in room 304, called out Nancy, the charge nurse, her voice carrying a hint of urgency that made Rita's stomach sink. She had been looking forward to finally sitting down for the first time in hours. "But my shift's almost over," Rita muttered under her breath, though she was already turning towards room 304. That was the thing about being a nurse. The job wasn't done until it was done, no matter what the clock said. The past 16 hours had been nothing short of chaos. 3 nurses had called in sick with that nasty flu going around, leaving the remaining staff scrambling to cover all the patients. Rita had already handled 2 emergency situations, helped with a difficult catheter insertion, and dealt with more paperwork than she cared to count. Her feet ached in her white sneakers, the ones she'd bought just last month, but already felt worn out. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a proper meal. The half-eaten yogurt and apple from her lunch break hardly counted. Her stomach growled in protest, reminding her of the dinner plans she had to cancel with her sister. Again. As she walked past the nurse's station, she caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection of a darkened computer screen. Dark circles had formed under her eyes, and her usually bright brown eyes looked dull with exhaustion. Her crisp blue scrubs, fresh and clean at the start of her first shift, now bore the marks of a hectic day. A small coffee stain from when she tried to multitask during her brief break, and wrinkles from constant movement. "Hey, Rita," called out Joe, one of the orderlies, as he rushed past with fresh linens. "Tough day, huh?" She managed a weak smile in response. Joe had been here as long as she had today, and he looked just as worn out. Her mind wandered to the stack of charts she still needed to update before leaving. There was also that incident report from the fall-risk patient who'd tried to get up without assistance, and she hadn't even started on her end-of-shift notes. The thought made her head pound even harder than it already was. Rita reached for her pocket, feeling for the granola bar she'd stashed there hours ago. Her fingers found only crumbs. She'd forgotten she'd already eaten it during her rushed 5-minute break between helping an elderly patient with his breathing treatment and assisting with a new admission. The hospital corridors seemed endless today. Every beeping monitor, every call light, every overhead page made her wince. She'd become a nurse to help people, driven by the memory of her grandmother who'd received such compassionate care during her final days. But right now, after nearly 16 hours of non-stop demands, even Rita had to admit she was running on fumes. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably another message from her roommate asking if she'd be home for their planned movie night. She didn't even bother checking it. At this point, all she could think about was her bed and the blessed silence of her room. As she approached room 304, Rita tried to put on her professional face, the one that showed none of the exhaustion, frustration, or overwhelming fatigue she felt. She'd gotten good at this mask over the years. It was part of the job after all. Patients didn't need to know that she'd been on her feet for 16 hours, or that she'd missed dinner, or that her back was killing her. Just as she reached for the door handle, her pager went off again. Another patient needed attention in room 215. Rita closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and tried to remember why she'd chosen this profession. She thought of all the thank you cards pinned to her bulletin board at home, the grateful smiles of recovered patients, the small victories that made it all worthwhile. But tonight, those memories felt distant. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. She didn't know it yet, but her next patient interaction would test her limits in ways she never expected, leading to a chain of events that would change her life forever. Rita pushed open the door to room 304, unaware that she was about to make a mistake that would haunt her career and force her to confront some uncomfortable truths about herself. In her exhausted state, she had no idea that the elderly patient waiting behind that door would turn out to be someone far more important than she could have imagined. Rita pushed open the door to room 304, where she found Mrs. Rose Anderson sitting upright in her hospital bed, her silver hair disheveled and her hands fidgeting with the blanket. The room had that distinct hospital smell, a mixture of sanitizer and fresh linens that never quite masked the underlying medical sense. Who are you?" Mrs. Anderson asked, her voice trembling slightly. Her pale blue eyes darted around the room, confusion evident on her face. "I was waiting for my daughter. She said she'd bring my purple sweater. I always wear my purple sweater on Tuesdays." Rita glanced at her watch. It was Thursday evening. She checked the patient's chart, noting the early stages of pneumonia and, more importantly, the recent dementia diagnosis. "Mrs. Anderson, I'm your nurse for tonight. Your daughter visited this morning, remember? She brought you some fresh clothes and your favorite books." The elderly woman's face crumpled slightly. No, that's not right. Today is Tuesday, and Martha always brings my sweater on Tuesdays." She reached for the call button again, the 5th time in the past hour, according to the notes. Rita moved to check Mrs. Anderson's vital signs, trying to maintain her professional composure despite her exhaustion. The blood pressure cuff wrapped around the older woman's thin arm, its automatic whirring filling the quiet room. "Your blood pressure is a bit high, Mrs. Anderson. Try to take some deep breaths for me." "I want to go home," Mrs. Anderson said suddenly, her voice stronger now. She pushed aside the blanket and tried to swing her legs over the side of the bed. "I need to feed my cat. Poor Timothy must be so hungry." Rita quickly moved to stop her. "Mrs. Anderson, you don't have a cat anymore, remember? Timothy passed away 3 years ago. Your daughter told us this morning." The words came out more abruptly than she'd intended, and she saw the flash of hurt cross the elderly woman's face. "You're lying," Mrs. Anderson insisted, becoming more agitated. "Timothy needs me, and I need my purple sweater. It's Tuesday, and Martha always brings my sweater on Tuesdays." She reached for the IV line in her arm, her fingers trembling as she tried to pull it out. "Please don't touch that," Rita said, gently but firmly moving the woman's hands away. She could feel her patience wearing thinner with each passing moment. The call light from room 215 was still unanswered, and she could hear the medication cart beeping in the hallway, signaling another patient's scheduled dose was due. Mrs. Anderson's eyes welled up with tears. "You're also mean here. I just want my sweater. I'm cold, and it's Tuesday, and Martha knows I need my sweater on Tuesdays." She reached for the call button again, pressing it repeatedly. The constant beeping echoed through the room, each sound like a tiny hammer against Reba's already throbbing head. She'd been on her feet for nearly 16 hours now, and this was the 3rd time today she'd had this exact same conversation with Mrs. Anderson. "Mrs. Anderson," Rita began, trying to keep her voice steady, "you're in the hospital because you have pneumonia. You need to rest and let the antibiotics do their work. Your daughter Martha will visit again tomorrow." She adjusted the blanket around the elderly woman's shoulders, noticing how fragile she seemed in the harsh hospital lighting. But Mrs. Anderson wasn't listening anymore. She had picked up a water cup with shaking hands, insisting she needed to water her plants. "My garden, my roses need water. They'll die without water." The cup trembled in her grip. Reba could feel the situation slipping away from her control. The exhaustion of her double shift weighed heavily on her shoulders, and Mrs. Anderson's confusion was pushing her to her limits. She didn't notice another patient's family member watching from the doorway, phone in hand, as the scene continued to unfold. Outside in the hallway, the usual hospital symphony played on, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the distant conversations of staff and visitors, the steady beeping of monitors. But inside room 304, tension was building like a pressure cooker about to blow. Mrs. Anderson's hand shook more violently, and before Rita could react, the water cup slipped from her grasp. Water splashed across the bedside table, soaking the patient's dinner tray and dripping onto the floor. The plastic cup clattered against the tiles, rolling under the bed. Oh dear, Mrs. Anderson fretted, trying again to get out of bed. "I need to clean this up. My roses, my purple sweater. Martha will be so upset if it gets wet. It's Tuesday, you know. She always brings it on Tuesdays." Rita stood frozen for a moment, staring at the spreading puddle of water. The long hours, the missed breaks, the constant demands. Everything seemed to converge in this one moment. She could feel something inside her about to snap, not realizing that what happened next would change everything. Rita's alarm went off at 6 a.m. the next morning, but she was already wide awake. She hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time, her mind replaying the previous night's events like a broken record. The morning sun filtered through her bedroom curtains, but it brought no warmth to her heavy heart. Reaching for her phone, she noticed an unusual number of notifications. Her stomach dropped as she opened the first message from her coworker. "Rita, have you seen the video? It's everywhere." Her hands trembling, she opened social media. There it was, a 3-minute video titled "Heartless Nurse Screams at Confused Elderly Patient." The thumbnail showed her face twisted in anger, caught in the worst moment of her professional career. The view count was already over 50,000. "This can't be happening," she whispered to herself, scrolling through the comments. Each one felt like a knife to her heart. How dare she treat an elderly person like that? This is what's wrong with healthcare today. She should lose her nursing license. I hope that was her last day as a nurse. The local community Facebook groups were buzzing with activity. Someone had identified Metropolitan General Hospital, and people were tagging the hospital's social media accounts demanding action. The local news stations had picked up the story, their morning broadcasts featuring clips from the viral video. Rita's phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor. "Emergency meeting at 9 a.m. Don't be late." The message was cold and formal, nothing like their usual friendly exchanges. She forced herself to get dressed, each movement feeling like she was underwater. Her navy blue scrubs, usually a source of pride, now felt like a costume she didn't deserve to wear. In the bathroom mirror, her reflection showed dark circles under her eyes and a pallor that made her look ill. The drive to the hospital was surreal. On the local morning radio, she heard her own name. A disturbing video has emerged from Metropolitan General Hospital, where nurse Rita Patel was recorded berating an elderly patient. She quickly switched off the radio, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. Walking through the hospital parking lot, she could feel eyes on her. A group of visitors whispered as she passed. A maintenance worker who usually greeted her warmly suddenly found something interesting to look at on the ground. Even the coffee cart vendor, who knew her order by heart, hesitated before taking her money. The hospital administrator's office was on the 5th floor. As Rita stepped out of the elevator, she saw Mrs. Anderson's daughter pacing in the hallway, talking angrily on her phone. Their eyes met briefly, and the look of disgust on the daughter's face made Rita want to disappear into the floor. The video has reached over 100,000 views, the hospital administrator said gravely, sliding a tablet across his desk to show Rita the latest numbers. "We've received hundreds of calls and emails. The press is outside asking for comments." Rita sat in the uncomfortable chair, feeling smaller by the second. On the wall behind the administrator's desk, she could see the hospital's mission statement: "Compassionate care, every patient, every time." The words seemed to mock her now. "I was just tired," she tried to explain, her voice barely above a whisper. 16 hours on duty. Mrs. Anderson kept trying to get up. "I didn't mean to." "This isn't about being tired," the administrator cut her off. "This is about the fundamental trust between healthcare providers and patients. You violated that trust, Rita. And now it's not just about you, it's about our hospital's reputation." Outside the office, she could hear phones ringing constantly. The PR team was huddled in a nearby conference room, drafting statements and response strategies. Someone mentioned that local news vans were setting up in the parking lot. "We're placing you on immediate administrative leave," the administrator continued. "The board will review the incident and decide on appropriate action. Please surrender your ID badge to HR before you leave." Rita nodded numbly, unable to form words. As she stood to leave, the administrator added, "And Rita? Stay off social media. Don't make any public statements. Let our PR team handle this." The walk to HR felt like a walk of shame. Every face she passed seemed to know who she was, what she'd done. Her phone kept buzzing in her pocket, more messages, more notifications, more evidence of how quickly her life was unraveling. In her car, finally alone, Rita broke down. Tears streamed down her face as she thought about her years of dedication to nursing, her genuine desire to help people, all potentially destroyed by one moment of weakness. What she didn't know yet was that the worst revelation was still to come, one that would make this viral nightmare seem like just the beginning. 3 days had passed since the video went viral. Rita sat in her apartment, blinds drawn, surrounded by empty coffee cups and half-eaten meals. The TV droned quietly in the background, though she barely heard it anymore. Her phone lay face down on the coffee table. She'd stopped checking it after the 100th angry message. A knock at her door made her jump. It was Nancy, her charge nurse, holding a paper bag from their favorite lunch spot. "You look terrible," Nancy said simply, walking in without waiting for an invitation. "And you need to come back to the hospital. There's something you need to know." Rita shook her head. "I can't go back there. Everyone's seen the video. Did you know someone made a meme out of my face? My own cousin shared it without realizing it was me." "This is important," Nancy insisted, setting down the bag. "The hospital board is meeting right now. They're reviewing your case and, well, there's something about Mrs. Anderson you don't know." The drive back to Metropolitan General felt endless. Rita wore sunglasses and a baseball cap, hoping to avoid recognition. The hospital looked different now, more intimidating, less like the second home it had been for the past 5 years. They took the back entrance, avoiding the main lobby where a local news crew was still hoping for a statement. The boardroom was on the top floor, its large windows overlooking the city. Rita had only been here once before, during her initial job interview. Inside, the hospital administrator sat at the head of a long table, along with several board members in business suits. But what caught Rita's attention was the distinguished-looking man standing by the window, his silver hair and familiar blue eyes making her heart stop. "Rita," the administrator began, "I'd like you to meet Robert Anderson, our city's mayor. Mrs. Rose Anderson is his mother." The room seemed to spin. Rita gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. The mayor, the man who had championed healthcare reform, who had fought for better conditions in nursing homes, who had just last month approved a major budget increase for the hospital's elderly care unit, was Mrs. Anderson's son. "Mr. Mayor, Rita's voice cracked. She couldn't find the words. Mayor Anderson raised his hand. "Please, sit down." His voice was tired, worried. "I think we all need to have an honest conversation about what happened that night." As Rita sank into a chair, the mayor pulled out his phone, showing a photo of a vibrant Mrs. Anderson from just 6 months ago. She was standing in a garden full of roses, wearing a purple sweater, smiling broadly. "This is my mother before the dementia accelerated," he explained. "She was a teacher for 40 years. She helped raise me alone after my father passed away. Those roses she kept talking about. She tended that garden for decades, won awards for it." Tears welled up in Rita's eyes as the mayor continued. "Timothy wasn't just a cat. He was her last connection to my father. Dad gave him to her just before he died. When Timothy passed away 3 years ago, that's when we first noticed signs of her memory slipping." The mayor walked to the window, his reflection showing a mixture of sadness and determination. "I chose Metropolitan General for her care because of its reputation for compassionate treatment. I didn't want special treatment. I wanted her to receive the same care any patient would get. That's why we didn't announce who she was." Rita felt the weight of every word. The confused elderly woman she berated wasn't just another difficult patient. She was someone's beloved mother, a retired teacher, a woman who had devoted her life to others. "The video has over 1 million views now," one of the board members added quietly. "People are using it to discuss the larger issues of elder care and medical staff burnout. It's become something of a movement." The mayor turned back to face the room. "I'm not here to demand your firing, Rita. I'm here because this incident has shown us something important. Our healthcare system is breaking down, and it's failing both patients and caregivers." Rita looked up, surprised. This wasn't the angry condemnation she'd expected. "My mother keeps asking for you," the mayor continued, making Rita's heart clench. "Even after everything, she's worried about that poor, tired nurse." Those were her exact words this morning. The room fell silent. Outside, the city stretched out under the afternoon sun, thousands of lives intersecting in countless ways. Somewhere in that sprawl of buildings and streets were other nurses working double shifts, other patients feeling lost and confused, other families trusting their loved ones to strangers' care. "So," the mayor said, pulling out a chair, "let's talk about how we can make this right. Not just for my mother, not just for you, but for everyone in our healthcare system who's struggling to keep up with impossible demands. Rita sat straighter in her chair, wiping her eyes. She didn't know it yet, but this meeting would mark the beginning of something much bigger than her personal redemption story. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Rita's small apartment as she stared at her laptop screen, reading the mayor's public statement for the 20th time. It had been released last night, and already the comments sections were flooded with responses. As many of you know, a video recently went viral showing an incident at Metropolitan General Hospital. The elderly patient in that video is my mother, Rose Anderson. While the treatment she received was unacceptable, this incident has revealed deeper problems in our healthcare system that we cannot ignore. Rita closed her eyes, remembering the long meeting in the boardroom. The mayor's words still echoed in her mind. We can turn this tragedy into an opportunity for change. Her phone buzzed, another news outlet requesting an interview. She turned down 12 already. But this message was different. It was from Nancy, her charge nurse. Channel 5 is doing a special report on healthcare worker burnout. The mayor thinks you should consider speaking. Call me. The thought made her stomach churn. Public speaking had never been her thing, and after the viral video, the idea of putting herself out there again was terrifying. But then she thought about Mrs. Anderson in her hospital bed, still asking about her poor, tired nurse. Rita's sister walked in with fresh coffee. You should do it, she said, having read the message over Reba's shoulder. Remember what you told me after the board meeting? About how this needs to be more than just about you. The past week had been a blur of meetings and soul-searching. The hospital's investigation had revealed that Rita wasn't the only nurse struggling with exhaustion and burnout. The administration had discovered that staff shortages had led to dangerous working conditions, with many nurses pulling double shifts several times a week. Rita opened her email, finding new messages from fellow nurses across the country. They shared similar stories: the exhaustion, the impossible demands, the guilt of not being able to give patients the attention they deserved. One message particularly stood out. I watched your video and saw myself. Last week, I almost made a serious medication error because I was so tired. We need to speak up about this. She picked up her phone and called Nancy. Within an hour, she was sitting in a small conference room at Channel 5, hands shaking as the makeup artist prepared her for the interview. The mayor was there too, along with Mrs. Anderson's daughter Martha. Just tell the truth, Martha said quietly, surprising Rita. Mom's doing better now, and she'd want something good to come from all this. The interview was harder than Rita expected. She fought back tears as she described the fateful night, her voice trembling as she acknowledged her mistakes. But then she spoke about the bigger picture, the systemic problems that had created the perfect storm. I was wrong, she said, looking directly into the camera. My behavior was inexcusable, and I'll spend the rest of my career making up for it. But this isn't just about one nurse losing her temper. It's about a system that's pushing healthcare workers to their breaking point, and ultimately, that affects every patient. The mayor spoke next, announcing new initiatives to address staff shortages and mental health support for healthcare workers. Rita felt a weight lift from her shoulders as he described the changes already being implemented at Metropolitan General: mandatory break times, additional staff hiring, and counseling services for employees. After the interview, Rita visited Mrs. Anderson. The elderly woman was sitting up in bed, looking better than she had that terrible night. When Rita entered, Mrs. Anderson smiled and patted the bed beside her. You look tired, dear, Mrs. Anderson said, her moment of clarity both touching and heartbreaking. My Robert says you've been working too hard. Everyone works too hard these days. Rita sat down carefully, fighting back tears. I'm so sorry about what happened, Mrs. Anderson. I should never have. Oh, hush, Mrs. Anderson interrupted, reaching for Rita's hand. Robert showed me the interview. You're trying to make things better. That's what matters. She paused, looking confused for a moment. Now have you seen my purple sweater? I always wear it on Tuesdays. Rita smiled gently, feeling both sad and hopeful. It's right here, Mrs. Anderson, she said, reaching for the sweater that Martha had brought. Would you like help putting it on? As she helped the elderly woman with her sweater, Rita thought about the changes already happening at the hospital. New nurses were being hired, schedules were being adjusted, and a peer support program was being developed. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Her phone buzzed again, another interview request. This time, instead of ignoring it, Rita decided to look at it later. Right now, she was exactly where she needed to be, doing what she always wanted to do, taking care of her patient, one moment at a time. 6 months had passed since the viral video that changed everything. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Metropolitan General's newly renovated break room as Rita pinned another certificate to the wall, this one for completing an advanced course in geriatric care. Next to it hung a photo from last month's healthcare reform conference, where she'd given her first keynote speech. "Ready for the big day?" Nancy asked, walking in with 2 cups of coffee. The break room was barely recognizable now, comfortable chairs, a meditation corner, and a wall of resources for staff mental health support. All changes that had come from that difficult time half a year ago. Rita took a deep breath, smoothing her fresh scrubs. "As ready as I'll ever be." Today was special. The hospital was launching its Care for Caregivers program, something she helped develop over the past few months. The hallways were busier than usual, filled with both familiar faces and new staff members hired as part of the hospital's reforms. Rita passed the nurses' station, where a clear schedule board showed reasonable shifts and mandatory break times. No more 16-hour marathons, no more skipped lunches. "Look who's here," called out Pete, one of the orderlies, pointing toward the entrance. Rita turned to see Mayor Anderson walking in, supporting his mother on his arm. Mrs. Anderson looked better than ever, wearing her favorite purple sweater and carrying a small photo album. "Rita, dear," Mrs. Anderson called out, her face lighting up. "I brought pictures of my roses. They're blooming so beautifully this year." Her dementia still caused confused moments, but with proper support and care, she'd become a regular visitor to the hospital, sharing her garden stories with other patients. The mayor smiled warmly. Mom insisted on coming today. She wanted to see the new changes herself. He looked around appreciatively at the calmer, more organized ward. Hard to believe how different things were just 6 months ago. Rita led them to the hospital's new community room, where staff and family members were gathering for the program launch. The room was packed. Nurses, doctors, administrators, and even some former patients. On one wall, a memorial board honored Timothy the cat, along with photos of Mrs. Anderson's award-winning roses. "Before we start," the hospital administrator announced, "I'd like to share some numbers. Since implementing our new policies, medication errors have dropped by 40%. Staff turnover is down by 60%. Patient satisfaction scores are the highest they've been in 10 years. Rita stood at the podium, her hands steadier than she expected. The faces looking back at her weren't judgmental anymore. They were supportive, understanding, ready to be part of the change. "6 months ago, I made a terrible mistake," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I let exhaustion and frustration override my duty of care. But thanks to the compassion of Mrs. Anderson and her family, that mistake became a catalyst for change." She gestured to the new staff support center visible through the windows. "Today, we're not just launching a program, we're changing the culture of healthcare. Every nurse, every doctor, every staff member deserves support. Because when we take care of our caregivers, they can take better care of our patients." Mrs. Anderson, sitting in the front row, nodded encouragingly. She might not remember all the details of what happened, but she understood the importance of this moment. The mayor squeezed his mother's hand, proud of how her story had sparked such meaningful change. After the ceremony, Rita walked Mrs. Anderson through the garden the hospital had planted in her honor. "These remind me of my roses at home," Mrs. Anderson said, touching a bright red bloom. "Though mine were always a bit bigger." She winked, showing a flash of her old spirit. Back inside, Rita checked her phone to find messages from hospitals across the country, asking about implementing similar programs. The viral video that had once haunted her had become a powerful tool for change, used in training sessions to show the importance of staff support and mental health. "You've turned quite the corner," Nancy commented, joining her at the nurses' station. The ward was running smoothly, with proper staffing levels and regular break rotations. "Remember when you thought your career was over?" Rita smiled, watching a new nurse helping an elderly patient with gentle patience. "It wasn't just me," she said. "It took everyone. The mayor, Mrs. Anderson, the staff, even the public who saw that video, to realize we needed change." Her shift would start soon, but not before she had proper rest and a real break. As she prepared for her rounds, Rita thought about how far they'd come. The viral video that had almost destroyed her career had instead sparked a movement for better healthcare practices. Mrs. Anderson waved goodbye as her son helped her toward the exit. "Don't forget to water the roses," she called out. Rita waved back, knowing that tomorrow Mrs. Anderson might not remember this day. But its impact would continue, helping countless healthcare workers and patients in the years to come. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching the certificates on the break room wall. Among them hung a small frame with a simple quote, "From our darkest moments come our greatest chances for change." Rita smiled, picked up her patient charts, and stepped forward into another day of compassionate care, this time with the support and resources needed to do it right.